The compass was the size of a quarter, worn smooth on one edge, where a thumb had rubbed it 10,000 times or more. Nolan Carter noticed it when she crossed the lobby of Whitfield Memorial. The woman in the slate blue blazer, moving fast, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and 3 people trying to keep pace behind her. He was changing a ballast in the overhead fixture near the reception desk 12 feet up on an aluminum ladder, and he should not have seen it at all. But the pendant caught the light in a specific way, a dull brass flash at the end of a silver chain, and his hand stopped moving on its own before his mind had processed why. He knew that compass. He had known its weight and its scratch pattern and the small crack along the east quadrant for 35 years. He had carried it in his left pocket every day until the morning he pressed it into a 10-year-old girl's palm and told her she would always know which way was home. He did not know her name now, or rather, he had known it then, and she had grown into someone else entirely. The name on the badge clipped to her blazer pocket read Dr. Audrey Voss, Chief Medical Officer. She walked through the lobby like someone who had learned very early that rooms do not wait for you. You shape them as you move through them, or you get left behind. She did not look up at the ladder. She walked through the front entrance and was gone. Nolan came down the ladder slowly and stood with one hand still on the aluminum rail. He was 46 years old. He had been a widower for 4 years. He had a 16-year-old son named Felix at home, a contractor's license issued in 2 states, and a thermos of black coffee he never remembered to finish. He had not thought about that morning at Greystone Children's Home in a long time. He had thought about it plenty. He gave himself a moment to be certain. The compass had belonged to his father. A navigational piece, brass, older than Nolan himself, picked up at a flea market in Cincinnati sometime in the 70s. His father had given it to him at 8 years old, 2 months before the accident on Route 9. It was the only thing of his father's he had ever kept. The crack along the east quadrant had happened when Nolan dropped it on a concrete step at 11. The same morning, a caseworker had told him he was being transferred to a new placement and had 60 minutes to pack. He had carried it to Greystone. He had given it to a girl on her last day there, because she had been afraid and he had been 11, and it was the only thing he had. He had never seen it again until now. He went back up the ladder and finished the ballast. Nolan had been contracted to Whitfield Memorial for 5 weeks. The work was straightforward. Aging infrastructure in a building expanded 4 times in 30 years, each addition installed by a different crew with different preferences, which meant the electrical and HVAC systems talk to each other the way 2 people talk when they have both learned different languages and are pretending otherwise. He found the work interesting in the way he found most mechanical problems interesting. There was a logic underneath that other people couldn't always see, and he had always been good at finding it. He had not known who ran the medical operations when he signed the contract. He learned Dr. Audrey Voss's name and title the same day he saw her cross the lobby. He learned the rest in pieces over the following week, the way you learn anything about a place by working inside it long enough, that she had taken the CMO position 18 months ago, under conditions that were still generating friction on the board, that she had come up through Johns Hopkins and 2 other major systems before this one, that she had reorganized the trauma department in her first 6 months in ways the senior staff had initially resisted and subsequently credited, and that the faction on the board that had never been comfortable with how she got the job had not stopped being uncomfortable. He learned this the way he learned everything, by being in the room and being quiet. He saw the compass twice more in the next 5 days. Once in the elevator where he was riding up to the 4th floor and she stepped in on the 2nd, already reading a document. He stood in the back corner and did not move. The pendant rested at the base of her throat, exactly where a compass sits when a person has stopped thinking of it as an object and started thinking of it as part of themselves. She got off on 6 without looking up. The second time was across a glass-walled conference room, a budget meeting, where she sat at the head of a long table, and the compass was barely visible above her collar. He was replacing a pneumatic seal in the corridor outside, and he was not watching. He noticed anyway. He thought about the logic of it. He had given it to a girl whose name he had been told was Audrey. He did not know her last name then. He did not know the family that had come for her. He had watched her walk down the front steps of Greystone with a small suitcase and the compass in her closed fist, and that had been the end of it. He had stayed at Greystone for another 2 years before aging out, and no one had told him anything about where she had gone. But she still had it, 35 years. That was not an item a person forgot to put on in the morning. That was a decision made daily over more mornings than most people bothered to count. He extended his contract, telling Pete Gruber, the facilities manager, that the fourth-floor mechanical room needed longer attention than originally scoped. This was true. It was also convenient. On a Wednesday in the second week of his extension, he had a legitimate reason to be on the 6th floor. A flagged pressure drop in the corridor HVAC, and he was working the service access panel outside the administrative wing when Dr. Audrey Voss came out of her office and found him there. She stopped, not the way people stop when they are startled. The way people stop when they see something they have been not quite expecting and have not fully decided what to do with. "I'm here for the pressure drop on this corridor," Nolan said, before she could say anything or choose not to. "Flagged in Tuesday's maintenance report." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much to invest in a conversation. "I know why facilities people are in the hallway, Mr. Carter, Nolan Carter. I'm contracted through Gruber's office." Something crossed her face. Small, controlled, "Mr. Carter." She said the name the way a person says a word that sounds familiar in a context they cannot immediately account for. Then, the pressure issue. "How long?" "Another hour, maybe 90 minutes. "All right." She moved to pass him. "You still have it," Nolan said. He did not plan to say it, he said it anyway. She stopped. "The compass," he said, "on the chain, the crack along the east mark. I dropped it on the front steps the same morning I got transferred to Greystone. You were leaving. I was 11. The silence had a specific quality, not the silence of someone who does not understand, the silence of someone who understands too well and is taking inventory of what that means. "That was a long time ago," she said finally. "Yes. I don't remember much about that placement." "I know." He turned back to the panel. "I'm not here for any other reason than the pressure drop. I just needed to say it once." She went back into her office. The door did not slam. It closed with the careful precision of someone who had learned that controlled exits are more useful than dramatic ones. Nolan worked for another hour, finished the job, wrote it up in the log. His hands were steady. His mind was something else. She did remember. He was certain of that the same way. He was certain of load tolerances and junction sequences. Not because he wanted it to be true, but because the evidence said so plainly. You did not wear something for 35 years and then claim you couldn't place where it came from. You wore something for 35 years because forgetting it was the option you had refused. The complications arrived without warning, as they generally do. The first was Felix. Nolan's son, on a Thursday afternoon, had been dropped at Whitfield by a neighbor due to a scheduling miscommunication. Felix sat in the lobby for 20 minutes before Nolan came down, and in those 20 minutes, Douglas Hartman had been in the lobby. Douglas Hartman was a board director who had been with Whitfield Memorial for 11 years, which was long enough to believe he understood the institution better than people who had built it. He was the organized kind of opposition, not loud but persistent, the type who kept files and waited for the right moment. He had been against Dr. Voss's appointment on grounds he described as structural, and which were, in practice, something closer to personal preference. He looked at Felix, then at Nolan, then made a connection in the way certain people make connections, immediately, efficiently, and with intent. The second complication followed within the week. Nolan noticed the change the same way he noticed changes in pressure systems, a small indicator, then another, then a pattern. A facilities supervisor began appearing on floors where Nolan was working. A work order was quietly rerouted. HR sent a message about verifying contractor scope. Someone was paying attention to him in an organized way, and that someone was not Pete Gruber. The hospital held its annual donor reception on a Friday evening in the atrium. Pete had asked Nolan to check the AV panel behind the stage before the event. He was supposed to be done and gone before the guests arrived. He was still working when they arrived. He was behind the panel access when Douglas Hartman found him. Hartman did not come alone. He brought 2 board members and the specific kind of pleasantness that functions as a weapon. He addressed Nolan by his first name, called attention to the contractor badge, expressed loud concern about extended access and appropriate boundaries, and did all of it in the general direction of the donors and senior staff close enough to hear, without appearing to have been aimed at them. Nolan stood with his tools and said nothing. Then Hartman stepped forward, not a grab, something lighter and therefore more deliberate, and his hand brushed Nolan's jacket pocket, where a small object was visible at the edge. Nolan stepped back, but the motion had already done it. The brass compass, which he had taken from a box in his garage 2 weeks ago and carried with him since because he had needed to hold something true, fell from his pocket and hit the atrium floor with a sound that was smaller than it should have been given how many people seemed to hear it. Hartman looked at it, then at Nolan. Then, with the timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment, his gaze moved across the atrium to where Dr. Audrey Voss had just entered from the south corridor. She saw the compass on the floor. She saw Nolan's face. She saw Hartman's expression, the expression of a man who had just been handed more than he was looking for. Her hand moved just slightly toward the pendant at her throat. Then it stilled. "I'd like to understand," Hartman said, pleasantly to the general air, "what a maintenance contractor's personal effects are doing at a Whitfield donor event." The atrium went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that happens when something is about to cost someone something. Dr. Audrey Voss stood at the edge of the gathering. She was in the room she had built, the staff she had promoted, the donors she had cultivated, the board members who had not voted for her and were still watching. Nolan watched her face and waited for the thing he had seen in the hallway outside her office, that brief unguarded moment. This time the surface held. "This area was scheduled for pre-event contractor work," she said, her voice exactly even. "I'll ask facilities to coordinate the timeline more carefully going forward." She did not look at Nolan. She did not look at the compass on the floor. An event coordinator appeared at Nolan's elbow. Quietly, efficiently, she indicated that the technical work was complete and the area was needed. Nolan bent, picked up the compass, and slid it back into his pocket. He followed the coordinator through the service door without looking back. But just before the corridor door swung shut, he heard the atrium resume, voices crystal, the soft machinery of a room that had decided nothing important had happened, and understood that she had chosen exactly what the room required her to choose. He sat in his truck in the parking structure, with the engine off and the compass in his palm. He called Pete and said to close out the contract by end of week. Then he drove home. He told Felix they were probably going to reorganize the storage unit, which was his way of saying he needed to do something with his hands that didn't require thinking. Felix, who was 16 and perceptive in the way teenagers are when they stop pretending not to be, said he'd help. They spent Saturday moving things without discussing why. The call came Sunday morning. He did not recognize the number, but he answered because his mother had taught him that avoidance was just a slower form of the same problem. "Mr. Carter," the voice was controlled and even, "this is Audrey Voss." He sat down on the garage step. "I know you've closed the contract," she said. "Pete told me. I'm not calling about the contract." A pause. "The compass. I have known what it is since the hallway. Since before that, if I'm honest, which I appear to be deciding to be." Another pause, shorter. "You gave it to me on a Tuesday morning in November. You told me your father had given it to you, and that you wanted me to have something that already knew how to find its way." He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the compass hadn't already said. "I kept it because I was 10 years old and I was terrified, and you were the first person in a very long time who gave me something without explaining what I was supposed to do with it." Her voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it that the level tone was working to hold in place. "I kept it because I didn't want to forget what that felt like." "I know," Nolan said. "I handled the event badly. I handled most of it badly." She stopped. Then, "I'm not calling to apologize, Mr. Carter. I'm calling because I left a board meeting 40 minutes ago and drove to your address, which I looked up 2 days ago and told myself I would not use, and your truck is not in the driveway, and I am standing on your front walk in a coat I put on over the clothes I wore to the meeting, and I would like you to come home." He stood up. "Give me 20 minutes," he said. She was still on the front walk when he pulled in. She had her hands in her coat pockets and she looked, for the first time since he had seen her cross the lobby at Whitfield, like someone who was not managing anything, just standing on a concrete path on a cold Sunday, having driven somewhere without being certain of what she would find. He got out of the truck and they stood in the gray morning air, and the distance between them was smaller than it had been since the steps of Greystone, which was the first morning and also, it turned out, not the last one. They did not resolve everything that day. There was the board's formal review, which produced a memo that was sharper in tone than Nolan would have liked, but which Audrey moved through with the same efficiency she brought to everything she considered worth finishing. Hartman was formally cautioned for conduct unbecoming a board representative. It was not a dramatic consequence, but it was a permanent one, and it was noted by people who kept notes about such things. There were conversations between Nolan and Audrey that started in the kitchen and ended somewhere neither of them had expected when the conversation began. There was Felix, who shook Audrey's hand at the door the first time she came to the house and said, with the particular gravity of a teenager who has decided to be polite on purpose, that he'd heard she was a doctor. Trauma primarily, she said. Felix nodded as though this explained something he had already been considering. My dad fixes things, he said. Different department, same idea. Nolan did not correct him. In late spring, on a Sunday when the light came in low through the kitchen window, and Felix was in the backyard doing something with the garden hose that Nolan had long since learned not to question, Audrey sat across the table from him with her coffee going cold, and the compass resting between them on the wood, where she had set it without deciding to. He looked at it. Keep it, he said. She looked at him. It was always yours, he said. I just needed to know it got where it was going. She picked it up and turned it once in her palm. The scratch on the south edge, the crack along the east quadrant, the worn spot where a thumb had rubbed it smooth, her thumb, across 35 years of mornings. Then she clasped it back at the base of her throat, and it settled where it had always settled, and she reached across the table for her coffee. Outside, Felix had turned the hose toward the small garden plot he had started from a kit in March. He was not an attentive gardener. He watered irregularly and had forgotten to label half of what he had planted. But something was growing anyway, green and unhurried, in the way things grow when the conditions are basically right, and no one makes the mistake of trying to force them. Nolan watched through the window. Some things find their way home on their own schedule. The compass had always known that. He had just needed 35 years to catch up.